Nobody warns you that the moment 10 guns swing in your direction, your brain doesn't inventory the threat. It catalogs the smell. Caramelized palm sugar and rendered short rib fat. 6 hours of Imani Dube's best work, rising off a ruined dress shirt like smoke off a coal fire. That was the first thing she registered, standing stone still in the dim service corridor of obsidian. Her copper saucepot shattered at her feet, its contents spreading in a dark, fragrant tide across $5,000 of Italian marble and one very expensive pair of bespoke shoes. The second thing she registered was that she wasn't afraid. She was furious, and she was past the point of caring what that meant. Obsidian occupied the top floor of a building that didn't have a public address. No sign on the door, no menu posted online, no Yelp page. You were either invited or you didn't exist. The city's wealthiest came here to eat without being watched, to negotiate without being recorded, to settle things that couldn't be settled in a boardroom. Imani had been working the line here for 2 years, grinding her way from prep cook to de facto head of the back kitchen, a title she held without the salary to match, because the actual head chef, a preening French-trained coward named Bertrand, collected the credit and left her with the burns. Tonight, Bertrand had called out sick, which meant Imani had run a 12-course tasting dinner for 40 covers, solo, on 4 hours of sleep and a gas burner that kept cutting out on the left side. She'd been carrying the saucepot herself, a 12-liter copper beast filled with her off-menu short rib broth, the one she developed in the staff kitchen on her own time. She'd slow-braised the ribs for 6 hours, building a base of smoked crayfish and charred onion, then married it with goshugaru and fermented black bean paste, and finally brightened the whole thing with palm sugar, reduced until it was nearly burnt. It was her blood and bone in a pot, a collision of her grandmother's Lagos kitchen, and every technique she'd learned in culinary school before the debt swallowed her whole. The floor was wet. She didn't see it until her left foot was already sliding. The pot went sideways. She fought it. God, she fought it. But 12 liters of physics doesn't care about your intentions. The copper rim caught the edge of a brass wall sconce. The lid flew off, and the entire contents launched in a wide, dark arc that hit Yoon Seo-jun directly in the chest. She'd seen his face in whispered conversations among the kitchen staff. He'd been in the news, or the edges of it, the kind of coverage that named no sources and drew no conclusions. A man who moved through the city's financial infrastructure like a current under ice, invisible until something broke. Tonight he'd come to Obsidian for a private dinner, just him and 4 of his men, occupying the back corridor suite, the club reserved for guests whose identity required an extra layer of discretion. He stood now with dark, spiced broth soaking through his dress shirt, dripping from the sharp line of his jaw, absolutely still. His 4 men were not still. Jackets had opened. Hardware had appeared. The corridor was suddenly very loud with the sound of mechanisms locking into readiness. Imani straightened her spine. She was exhausted. Her feet ached. She had $412 in her bank account, $88,000 in culinary school debt, and her grandmother's memory care facility in Crown Heights was 4 months behind on payment. She had 0 patience left for men who expressed displeasure with guns. "You'll want to lower those," she said, her voice steady in the dripping silence, "before the smell gets into the walls. Short rib fat is a nightmare to air out." Not one of the men moved, but Yoon Seo-jun looked at her. Really looked. Not the quick threat assessment scan his guards were running. He looked at her the way she looked at a new ingredient, taking inventory, noting what was unexpected. Then the smell reached him. It hit him somewhere below the collar. The gochugaru first, familiar, Korean, the smell of something he recognized before he could name it, but wrapped in a deeper smoke that bypassed his rational mind entirely and landed in a cramped memory. His Halmione's apartment in Busan, the window fogged with winter. A pot on the stove that smelled like warmth manufactured specifically against the cold. Before the money, before the empire, before he'd understood that the world was a negotiation between wolves and that mercy was something you buried or it buried you. His hand moved before he decided to move it. He touched his own lapel, brought one finger to his lips. His head of security said his name, low, urgent. Seo-jun ignored it. His eyes closed for 3 full seconds. When they opened, the murderous voltage that had been radiating off him since he walked through Obsidian's front door had shifted into something harder to read and more dangerous. He raised one hand. The guns disappeared. Imani exhaled. She didn't let him see it. "Who made this?" Seo-jun said. "Not a question." "I did." He studied her. Flower on her collar, burn scar on her left wrist, the absolute zero in her expression that said she had decided somewhere in the last 30 seconds not to waste time on fear. "You're not the head chef." "Functionally, I am. The man with the title is home with a stomachache that I strongly suspect is moral in origin." The corner of his mouth moved. "Almost nothing. Almost. You'll come with me." "I won't." The silence after that was the loudest thing Imani had ever stood inside. She argued. She cited her employment contract, her remaining covers, the veal stock that would break if nobody watched it. He listened with the patience of a man who had already made a decision and was simply allowing her the dignity of finishing her sentence. Then he made a phone call. One number 12 seconds of Korean. 4 minutes later, Obsidian's managing partner was in the corridor, gray-faced, handing Seo-jun a document giving him full operational rights over the club's kitchen staff. Imani stared at it. "He bought the building's parent company," the managing partner whispered, eyes averted from Seo-jun entirely. 6 minutes ago." "That's not possible." "Imani." Seo-jun set a leather portfolio on the corridor credenza and opened it himself. Clean type, precise formatting, a private executive chef contract, residential assignment. And at the top of the second page, a bank receipt, her culinary school loan servicer, balance cleared to 0, timestamped 11 minutes ago. Her knees did not buckle. She was proud of that. Below it, a second receipt, her grandmother's facility in Crown Heights. 16 months of care, paid in advance. "You had no right to access my financial records," she said. Her voice was flat enough to lay glass on. "No," Seo-jun agreed. "Sign the contract." She picked up the gold pen he offered. She signed the way she'd once broken down a whole chicken in a practical exam. Fast, deliberate, without looking up. The pen was absurdly heavy, like holding a small verdict. She was going to regret this. She already knew it. His penthouse occupied 2 floors above the financial district, all black marble and reinforced glass, and the particular silence that money bodies specifically to keep the world at distance. It was cold and beautiful and completely devoid of warmth, the way very expensive things often are. And then there was the kitchen, which was the one room that made her breath catch despite herself. A 10-burner range, a wood-fired hearth built into the stone wall, a pantry stocked with ingredients she'd spent years trying to source, first flush Darjeeling, aged balsamic she'd only ever read about, dried uziza leaf from a specialty importer she'd been chasing for 2 years. He knew exactly what he was doing. She hated him for it, and she claimed the kitchen anyway, with the territorial focus of someone who understands that a space can be a fortress if you treat it like one. The guards learned the rules inside 48 hours. No entry without washed hands. No loitering near the prep station. No touching the mise en place. No asking what she was cooking, because the answer would always be none of your business, and a pointed look at the door. Seojun's operations director arrived on the third morning. Oh Chanwoo was older, 60, maybe older, with salt and gray hair and the face of a man who had absorbed decades of violence without its ever touching his expression. He stood at the kitchen's threshold and looked at Imani the way some men look at structural problems in buildings they're planning to knock down. "You cook street food," he said. His English was measured, each word deliberate. "Mr. Yoon requires refinement." Imani kept her knife moving through the shallots. Mr. Yoon licked broth off his own lapel in a service corridor and decided I was worth the price of a building. I think we have different definitions of refinement. The vein at Chanwoo's temple pulsed. "You are a distraction," he said, "an outsider who does not understand this house." "What this house requires," Imani said, setting her knife down and turning to face him with the full weight of her attention, "is for you to remain on that side of the threshold. Your cologne is getting into my butter." He left, but she felt him watching, the way you feel a storm system before the pressure drops. It was 2:47 in the morning when she heard Seojun's footsteps in the hall. Not footsteps exactly, the specific quality of silence a large man makes in bare feet when he's trying not to wake the house. She'd been in the kitchen since midnight, unable to lie in the too expensive guest suite one more hour, driven back to the only place that made sense to her. She was making a pot of her grandmother's midnight porridge, palm oil and crayfish stock and dried uziza leaf, cooked low and slow until the smell of it filled the kitchen like a memory made physical. She hadn't made it in years. She hadn't realized how much she needed to until now. When she looked up, Seojun was in the kitchen's archway, in gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt, and the sight of him stopped her hand on the wooden spoon. The untouchable executive was gone. What stood in his place looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in months. His eyes were red at the edges. His hands gripped the door frame the way you grip something, when the floor isn't quite where you left it. She recognized that look. She'd seen it on her cousin who came back changed from overseas, on her father during the years he didn't speak about. Men who carried the weight of their choices through the night, because the night had no mercy. She didn't say anything. She ladled a second bowl, set it on the counter beside her own, and waited. He crossed the kitchen. He sat. He looked at the bowl for a long time, as though it might be a trap, and then he picked up the spoon. He ate in silence. She ate beside him. The only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional tap of ceramic on marble. "What is this?" he said finally. "My grandmother called it midnight fix. She made it whenever the world was too heavy." He looked at the bowl. "It's good." "I know." Another silence. A different kind, not the silence of threat, but of two people existing in the same space without requiring anything from each other. "I don't sleep," he said, more to the counter than to her. "I noticed." "The dreams." He stopped, a man who had no practice finishing sentences like that. "You don't have to explain it." She set down her spoon. "I don't know what you've done or who you've had to be to get where you are, but whatever it is, it's eating you from the inside. That's not a judgment. It's just what I see." When she looked up, he was already looking at her. The kitchen felt smaller than it had 60 seconds ago. "Why did you cook for me?" His voice was quiet in a way that cost him something. "You despise what I did." "I don't despise you." She considered this honestly. "I don't like what you did, but I don't let people starve in my kitchen." She stood and gathered her bowl. "Not even wolves." She was 2 steps from the doorway when his hand caught her wrist. Not hard, just a question. a presence. She turned. He was standing closer than she'd registered, the heat of him crossing the space between them before she was ready for it. He looked at her with that same focused attention he'd turned on her in the corridor, like he was taking inventory of something he hadn't expected to find and wasn't sure yet what to do with. She lifted her chin. "Get some sleep, Seo-jun." She walked out. She lay in the dark for the next hour, with her heart doing things she had no business permitting. The argument about the market happened 12 days in, over a basket of inadequate galangal and a jar of spice paste that tasted like industrial sadness. She needed fresh ingredients from the wholesale district on the south side. The kind you had to select hand, because the difference between fresh and barely fresh would ruin everything she was building. He said no. She argued for 20 minutes with the focused intensity she usually reserved for a menu she believed in. He changed his answer to a heavily escorted yes. 3 men, an armored SUV, a list of her rules. Don't crowd her, don't touch the produce, don't speak to the vendors in a manner that makes them uncomfortable, because she had relationships in this district that mattered to her more than his operational protocols. The wholesale market on Fulton's south end was the closest thing Imani had to a church. The stacked crates of suya spice and ground egusi and bitter leaf that didn't survive refrigeration. The smell of it, sharp and smoky and layered, hit her like a pressure shift, the way the air changes before rain. She breathed it in and felt, for the first time in weeks, like herself. She was at the third stall, sorting through dried hibiscus and checking the color against the morning light, when the market changed frequency. The noise thinned. The vendor 2 stalls down pulled his displays behind his curtain without being asked. Her lead guard had his hand inside his jacket before she registered the silence. "Behind me," he said. The first shot came from the north end, and then everything was motion. Stalls, overturning, screams tearing through the narrow aisles, the flat crack of return fire. And Imani was running, crouched low, her hands still wrapped around the hibiscus bag because her body hadn't caught up with her brain. They turned into a loading alley. A man stepped out from behind a stacked pallet with a weapon the size of her forearm pointed at her guard's head. Her guard was covering their retreat. He couldn't swing around in time. Imani's hands moved. She carried her pastry kit everywhere, a habit built from years of working in under-equipped kitchens, of showing up somewhere and finding nothing you could trust. Her right hand found the blowtorch by feel alone, butane canister, brass tip, the ignition trigger she'd depressed 10,000 times over creme brulee and pulled sugar and the glossy tops of fruit tarts. She thumbed the trigger. A column of blue flame, 6 inches long and entirely serious, shot directly into the gunman's face. He screamed. He dropped everything. He went to his knees with his hands over his eyes, and her guard disarmed him in the next 2 seconds and looked back at Imani, at the woman who had just taken down an armed man with a kitchen blowtorch, with an expression she was going to carry with her for a long time. "Move," she said. Her voice was steady. She had no idea how. They made it to the vehicle. The drive back was absolute silence. Imani sat with the blowtorch in her hand and watched her own fingers shake and did not look away from them, because looking away felt like giving herself permission to fall apart, and she wasn't doing that. When they returned, Seo-jun was already in the entry hall. Jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the controlled calm he usually wore cracked clean through. He looked at her the way she had seen him look at nothing else, with the frantic inventory of someone searching for damage, for proof of absence, for the thing he had almost lost, before he decided he was allowed to want it. He crossed the room before she could speak. His hands found her face, thumbs tracing over her cheekbones, with a franticness completely unlike the man who bought buildings by phone. "You're here," he said, rough. "They told me there was shooting. They said the market." "I'm here." She put her hands over his, felt his pulse, violent and unsteady, against her palms. "I'm right here, Soo-jun." He made a sound that she would never be able to describe accurately to anyone. And then he leaned down and kissed her. Not a question, but the answer to one he'd been carrying for weeks. Urgent and ungoverned, tasting of dark coffee, and every long night spent on opposite sides of the kitchen island. She kissed him back. She'd been fighting this the way you fight a current. Putting energy into resistance instead of acknowledging where it was always going to take you. The peace summit was Seo-jun's next move. 6 days after the market, he called a formal dinner at the penthouse, the heads of 4 rival organizations, including the one he suspected had authorized the hit. Forcing them onto his territory was a statement. "I am not shaken. You could not shake me." He wanted her as his architecture. "Make something they spend the entire meal thinking about," he told her, standing in the kitchen doorway, with the specific heat between them still unspoken but no longer pretended away. "I need their attention on the table, not on me." She treated it as the most serious commission of her life. 6 courses, each one a deliberate act. Bene seed amuse-bouche, jollof arancini with aged parmesan, palm butter poached langoustine in a saffron consommé, her short rib broth served as a standalone course with uziza oil and fermented chili, and a closing ganache of dark chocolate and bitter leaf that would leave a complex, trailing heat on the palate long after the plates were cleared. The kind of meal that makes dangerous men feel, against their will, like guests. It worked. She could feel it through the kitchen's small window. The quality of the silence when each course arrived, the conversation slowing after the consommé, the specific body language of men who have stopped performing and started simply eating. She watched the rival boss across from Soo-jun take his first bite of the short rib broth and close his eyes involuntarily for 3 full seconds. She knew that feeling. She had designed it. She was plating the 5th course when Oh Chan-woo carried a bottle into the dining room. She'd been watching Chan-woo all evening. He moved through the penthouse with the ease of a man who'd been calculating something for a long time and believed the final step was close. She noticed the way he positioned himself near Seo-jun's chair, not behind, the way a loyal second would stand. Beside, already beginning to fill the space. She watched him pour. He poured the rival boss's glasses first, moving deliberately around the table, the bottle always visible. And then she watched him pour Seo-jun's glass from a slightly different angle, his body momentarily blocking the table's sightline from the men across from him. 1 second, maybe 2. The 5th course went out. She turned back to her station and began laying the dessert components. Then she heard the chair, the crash of crystal, a silence so specific and wrong that she was through the kitchen doors, before she finished screaming his name. What followed took 4 minutes and felt like the rest of her life. Seo-jun's guards drew. The rival bosses drew back. Chan-woo stood over his fallen employer with the practiced sorrow of a man who had rehearsed it, and when he turned to Imani, she saw behind the grief, clean, patient, satisfied, the face of the man who had built all of this. "She poisoned his food," Chan-woo said, and his voice was perfect, measured. The voice of a man stating something obvious to a room that needed to hear it clearly. She controlled everything he ate. She refused inspection. She is the only person who touched what reached that table. They put her in a room in the sublevels. Concrete floor, a single caged bulb, the smell of cold iron and old water. She sat with her back to the wall and she rebuilt the dinner in her head, ingredient by ingredient, course by course, the way she reconstructed a failed dish, not from feeling but from sequence. The langoustine, the consommé, the short rib. She had tasted every element herself during plating. If the base components were compromised, she would be in a hospital bed. The dessert hadn't left the kitchen. So what had Seo-jun consumed between the fourth course and the collapse? The wine. And she thought about the crystal. She had polished those goblets herself that morning, 12 of them, arranged on the sideboard in the order they'd be placed. A fast-acting contact poison on the inner wall of a specific goblet. The wine would do the rest. Chan-woo had been in the dining room while she was running the kitchen. 2 minutes was more than enough. He'd known exactly which position Seo-jun would occupy, because Seo-jun always sat at the head, always had, and Chan-woo had set that table himself for a decade. Imani stood up from the concrete floor. She'd been carrying her pastry kit, as she always did, in the reinforced inner pocket of her chef's coat, sewn in by her own hand because she had worked in enough uncertain environments to know that a cook is never truly without resources. A 3-inch paring knife, a small butane canister, the spare igniter from her blowtorch kit. The guard who came for her was arrogant. He thought she was a cook. He was right. That was the part he'd miscalculated. She made it to the service elevator with his key card and radio. She listened to the frequency. Medical wing, 49th floor. She pressed the button and watched the numbers climb. The room was white, and Seo-jun was at the center of it, connected to equipment that was doing the work his body couldn't manage alone. His skin was the color of chalk. His chest moved with the shallow irregularity of something that hadn't yet decided. Chan-woo stood at the foot of the bed with a pillow in his hands and the expression of a man finalizing something he should have done sooner. Imani came through the frosted glass at a run. She lit the blowtorch 3 feet from Chan-woo's face. He recoiled, dropping the pillow, and she swung the canister body in a hard horizontal arc and caught his forearm with the full force of her momentum behind it. Something broke. He screamed. He still got his gun clear. She'd expected that. And she threw herself flat as Seo-jun's hand came up from beneath the mattress, weak and shaking and barely clearing the sheets, and put 2 quiet shots into the only available target. Chan-woo was gone before he finished falling. Seo-jun's arm dropped. His head went back against the pillow. The monitor changed its tone. "Don't you dare," Imani said, and grabbed his face with both hands and kept saying his name until the door opened behind her, and the doctor came through. And then she stood back and let them work with her hands shaking so badly she had to press them together to keep them still. It took 3 weeks. She didn't leave. Not as a prisoner. The guards stopped treating her like one somewhere around day 4, and after that they started bringing her what she asked for without being told twice. She cooked broths designed to rebuild a body from its foundation. She argued with the medical staff about his fluid intake and won. She slept in the chair beside his bed until he was strong enough to reach out in the dark and pull her into it without asking, and she let him because some things don't require negotiation. The syndicate restructured. The men aligned with Chan-woo's vision of what the organization should be were removed with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent years learning exactly how structures fail. The peace treaty held. Seo-jun coordinated all of it from a hospital bed, with an IV line in his arm and the particular clarity of someone who has looked at what almost happened and decided to stop being careless about what matters. 5 months later, Imani stood on a sidewalk in the West Village with a ring of keys in her hand, looking at paint that still smelled fresh on a window that read Ember and Jollof in clean gold letters. her name on the business license, her grandmother's photograph on the staff wall in the kitchen, her menu on the board, handwritten, nothing apologized for. Seojun had structured the funding through 3 separate legal entities and brought her the keys one morning without ceremony, setting them on the kitchen counter and saying nothing, which was how she knew it was the most significant thing he'd ever given anyone. Opening night was a full house, every table, every cover, the kitchen running at a pace that Imani had spent her entire professional life training for. The menu was everything she was: jollof arancini and suya glazed lamb, and a short rib consommé course that made the reviewer from the Times set down her pen and simply eat. When the last dessert went out, and the dining room settled into the low, satisfied murmur of people who had been fed beyond their expectations, Imani untied her apron and walked out of the open kitchen. He was in the corner booth, charcoal suit, a glass of bourbon he'd barely touched. And the way his eyes found her from across the room, the exact moment she stepped out from behind the glass, carried the specific warmth of a man who had rearranged the whole structure of his life around one fixed point and was not sorry about it. She slid into the booth beside him, not across from him. He pulled her close without being asked, and pressed his face to the curve of her neck, and breathed in like a man who has spent a long time in rooms without windows and has only recently remembered what air tastes like. "You fed the whole city tonight," he said, low against her skin. "We built something real," she said. She looked at the room around them, the warm brick, the candlelight, the tables full of strangers who had no idea how any of this had come to exist. She thought about a copper pot sliding from her hands in a dim corridor, and the smell of it landing on a man who needed, more than he knew, to remember he was still human. She thought about the cost of everything, the weight of a gold pen, the specific balance of a 3-inch knife in a dark room, the way a person looks when the armor cracks and something true comes through. "We did," Seojun said. He kissed her temple. He held on. She didn't need saving. She never had. She just needed a kitchen, fierce enough to hold everything she carried, and the kind of fire that doesn't go out when someone opens the door.